Narendra Modi is very proud of the unique identity of Indians, doesn't succumb to political correctness. India belongs in my heart.
Canada, because of what is touted as free speech and liberal values, have also seen a lot of Khalistani protests. These Khalistanis, I don't know if you're aware of the history, and these are violent anti-India protests. Trudeau has not voiced his opposition to those protests because it caters to his vote bank. In a way, I find certain similarities, if not parallels, with the protests. And I think that is also one of the issues which you discuss, overall in the Parasitic Mind, how being woke or politically correct, we are allowing certain elements and protests and allowing certain activities in the society.
Justin Trudeau is a walking manifestation of every idea pathogen that I discuss in the Parasitic Mind, whether it be radical feminism, whether it be social constructivism, whether it be cultural relativism, whether it be postmodernism, whether it be political correctness, whether it be identity politics. Each of those concepts is what I call a parasitic idea. And Justin Trudeau is parasitized by every single one of those ideas, right? So yes, but by the way, I hate to be the one to remind people I told you so, but before he became prime minister in 2015, I was going to the top of the mountain and screaming and saying, do not vote for this guy. This is a very, very dangerous guy because he's a unique mix of profound imbecility, incredible narcissism, and then a complete parasitized mind. You talk about, quote, white privilege. Well, this guy, his only contribution until the end time he entered in politics on the wings of his father's name was that he was a substitute drama teacher in high school. That was the highest professional goal that he had achieved. And then a few years later, he is the prime minister of, a leading Western country. So now, of course, what that speaks to, by the way, is something that I talk about in the Parasitic Mind, which is that most people use the wrong processes in choosing their prime ministers. And here I want to show you something. Let's suppose, forgive me for a second here, I'm going to use a prop. This is just the cover of a pen. There is an expression in Arabic, which I'm going to translate in English. It says, getting drunk simply by smelling the cork of the wine bottle. So here I want you to imagine that this is the cork of the wine bottle. So now watch this, Mr. Das. I'm going to get drunk. Now I'm not going to I don't even need to drink the wine bottle to get drunk. I am so weak in my constituency that simply whiffing it, I get drunk. Now, how do we apply this metaphor to how people vote for prime ministers? So now I'm going to smell the cork of Justin Trudeau. He's tall. He's young. He's got beautiful hair. You see how I'm getting drunk? So it doesn't matter if each of his positions is disastrously incorrect. I am getting drunk by his dreamy hair. Same thing for Barack Obama. He's tall. He's got a radiant smile. He's got a mellifluous voice. Sign me up. I'm voting for Obama. On the other hand, now watch how I'm going to get drunk in the opposite way for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is disgusting. He's vulgar. He's an ogre. Now, you notice in both of all those cases, I never evaluated the cognitive content of I didn't say I love Justin Trudeau because of his immigration policy or his fiscal policy or his tax policy. most people are cognitively lazy. So they simply see some representation. They allow their emotional system to hijack their thinking system. And therefore, we get imbeciles like Justin Trudeau, who's now been leading our country for 8 years. And this is what I try to fight about. This is why I wrote The Parasitic Mind, because I saw that. So I have faced two great wars in my life. I have the first war is the Lebanese Civil War that I talked about. The second great war is, as a professor of 30 years, I've seen the war on reason, the war on logic, the war on science, the war on common sense, and it all starts within the university ecosystem.
Do you think Israel and India face similar challenges and there are certain similarities?
They do. So I will say this, and I'm not saying this because I'm speaking to an Indian outlet. I speak very directly. I have a great affinity and love for India. As a matter of fact, when I did my PhD at Cornell University, my closest friends were all Indian. Anil Kaul, Abhilash Dave, Rahul Guha. So, even one of my favorite professors, who's now a professor at University of Chicago, is Professor Pradeep Shintagunta. So there were, everywhere I turned, there was some, brilliant Indian student that was hanging around with me. Now, I think the reason for the affinity is twofold. I think that both, if I could speak about the Jews and hence the Indians, we both have a deep reverence and love of learning. And that there's a deep love for cerebral intellectual pursuits. Now, I don't mean to imply that other societies don't also have love for learning, but it is somewhat unique that both the Jews and Indians have this deep, insatiable appetite for learning in India, where you better be a doctor, you better become a professor, you better be an engineer at the Indian Institute of Technology, you better be the top of the top. And so I admire that kind of standard of excellence. And so I think, for me at least, on a personal level, that's why I have an affinity with India. The other thing I would say is India seems to have a love of life. The movies and the Bollywood dancing and the great food, that is not necessarily only a Jewish thing. It's a Middle Eastern thing where we also love food. We also have a great culture of hospitality. And so there are all of these overlapping values that gives me a great sense of affinity. And of course, if I can conclude by saying it also didn't hurt, and forgive me for saying this, when your honorable Prime Minister, to my surprise, chose me as, to send me a personal letter of commendation in the, I think, 2022 Republic Day. When I first received the email, I thought it was one of those phishing emails. When you receive an email from some Nigerian prince. And I received an email from the High Commissioner of India to Canada saying, "Oh, we'd like to deliver a personal letter from Narendra Modi." And I was like, yeah, sure. But then it turned out to be true. So for all sorts of reasons, India belongs in my heart.
What do you think of Prime Minister Modi and his leadership?
So I don't know. One of the things that I'm very careful to do is that when I know about something, I speak with full assuredness. And when I don't know, I'm the first to say, I don't know enough about it. So I don't know enough about the internal politics of India to be able to say, I like this about him or I don't like this about him. But he certainly seems to be, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, someone who doesn't succumb to political correctness. He does seem to be someone who does hold pride in the Hindu nature, the majority nature of the society. He doesn't apologize for the fact that you can be patriotic of your identity without being nasty to minorities. I think that's one of the things that regrettably we've lost in the West, because in the West, what you now hear every Western leader say, certainly Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, is there is no such thing as Canadian values. We don't have a Canadian identity. that's a terrible thing to say if you're a prime minister. I mean, sure, you want to be welcoming to all sorts of immigrants. I'm an immigrant, so I don't need to be lectured about the importance of, being open to immigrants. But once I came to Canada, I adopted the Canadian values of tolerance, of freedom of speech, and so on. So for a prime minister to say that there are no Canadian values, we transcend any Canadian values, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Narendra Modi doesn't say that. He is very proud of the unique identity of Indians, and I support that.
Okay, so going back to our main questions. So we digressed, and we digressed beautifully, covering a lot of ground from our main questions. One thing which several countries forget, the only two countries which come to my mind when we talk about zero anti-Semitism is India and China. And you had a recent tweet which said, learn Mandarin and Cantonese and just keep your fingers crossed so that China allows. What made you?
Right. So what I was saying there, people misunderstood that. And I actually received some angry emails from Indian folks saying, well, why did you choose China? We're much nicer to the Jews than the... I was being facetious there. I was demonstrating the adage or the maxim, my enemy's enemy is my friend, meaning that the Chinese do not tolerate some of the sources of Jew hatred that we spoke about earlier, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they treat their minorities very nicely. And I don't need to be lectured by anybody about how nasty the CCP can be and how antithetical to the freedoms that I support, freedom of conscience and freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry. Of course, I understand that the CCP doesn't support many of those values, but I was jokingly saying that at least if you go to China, you know that the number one group who hates the Jews and wants to eradicate the Jews, well, China doesn't tolerate them too much. Now, that doesn't mean that I condone the mistreatment of any group. I think what China does to some of its minorities is horrible, but that's what I meant in that sense. So the Indian folks don't need to be angry at me. I appreciate the fact that there's never been any anti-Semitism from India. And also, I know that there is a very old ancestral Jewish community in India. I'm well aware of that. And so I understand those realities.